Hi, everybody. I'm Brad Kelly, the Regional Coordinator for the Society of Biblical Literature's Pacific Coast region. And I'm excited to welcome you to this installment of this year's SBL Pacific Coast Regional Meeting that we're calling K-Ray and Kativ, Read and Written. Obviously, things are a little different with the pandemic this year, so some of the papers are coming to you as recorded video presentations. And I'm excited about this paper. We have a paper from Leah Macinskas-Le from the Graduate Theological Union. This is a paper from our program unit, New Testament Gospels and Acts at the regional meeting. And so the format will be, the paper will be 20 minutes, and then the chairperson of that unit, Dr. Tom Phillips, will come on and interact a little bit with our presenter to wrap up our time. So without further delay, let me turn it over to Leah Macinskas-Le. And the title of her paper is Joseph's Righteousness, the Torah, and the Angel's Revelation, a Narrative Analysis. Leah, if you would, please.
Thank you. Matthew uses the opening of his gospel to introduce his audience to Jesus the Messiah. First, he gives a genealogy, then he narrates the miraculous nature of Jesus' conception and the righteousness of his human father. By immediately making the conception of the Messiah into a halakhic issue that is a matter of Torah interpretation and observance, Matthew is able to prime his audience for Jesus' own halakha, which he delivers throughout the gospel. While the words law, law-abiding, and legal are often English terms used in the discussion of halakha, they are dangerous and run the risk of identifying the Torah of Moses and halakha with Western post-Enlightenment legal structures. I find that Jewish practice or Torah observance, Torah interpretation are better translations, although it could be argued that halakha is substantially untranslatable because it is a particularly Jewish concept. In this, I agree with Lawrence Schiffman, who says, such English words as law, legal, etc. imply for Western readers civil and criminal law. For ancient Jews, indeed for Jews throughout the ages until the rise of modernity, the life of Torah and its various interpretations was the dominant form of law and religious expression. Opening the gospel with a halakhic dilemma also serves to give the audience someone with whom they can identify. There is no reason that a Jewish audience would consider Joseph unrighteous for divorcing his pregnant betrothed wife when he knew that he was not the father of her child. By constructing a narrative in which Joseph is put in such a position and then resolving it with a divine dream, Matthew uses the sympathy garnered for him to prepare his audience for the new halakha of Jesus, the divinely conceived Emmanuel. It also allows his Jewish audience to go on being Jewish and respecting the Torah. By giving Joseph a divine resolution to his halakhic dilemma, Matthew shows his audience at the very beginning of his gospel that God is imparting a new halakha, a new interpretation of Torah to Israel through Jesus. The ancient cultures of the Mediterranean and the Near East were fairly unanimous that dreams could contain messages from the divine. People also held that those messages should be heeded, but one might need to engage in interpretation or go to a professional dream interpreter to get the message correct. In the immediate Jewish inherited context, several people in the Tanakh are both recipients of divinely given dreams, for example, Abraham in Genesis 15, and divinely inspired dream interpreters, Joseph and Daniel. The content of Abraham's dream is that of a divine voice, but the dreams that Joseph and Daniel interpret are dreams of imagery, which are disturbing and yet opaque. This pattern holds common in other ancient dream narratives. In the 5th century BCE Athenian tragedian Sophocles, his version of the Mycenae family revenge tragedy, the play Electra, has Queen Clytemnestra receiving a nightmare which prompts her to offer sacrifices at the tomb of the husband she has just murdered. Juvenal, 700 years later in the 2nd century CE, specifically satirizes this dream in his 6th satire. In a specifically Jewish take on the revelatory dream, by the Second Temple period, halakha had become legitimate content for dreams. John Endries observes that in Jubilees 30 through 34, it contains several insertions of what he calls halakhic exhortation in the text's retelling of Genesis. This section includes the addition of several dreams not found in the canonical biblical text. He notes, In the biblical story, dreams play a significant role, especially in the Jacob and Joseph traditions. In Jubilees, these are presented faithfully, but this author has described additional dream visions which play a key role in the interpretation of the sacred story. These dreams are woven in with halachic exhortations and in some cases directly relate to them. For example, Jacob has a night vision concerning the abandonment of Bethel and return to Hebron. And immediately after, the text informs the reader of the obligation to celebrate the 8th day of Tabernacles as the addition. Also, a dream commanding the priestly ordination of Levi is quote unquote confirmed in the next section where the institution of a new tithe is presented. Joseph's dream is contained in a pericope, which usually has its lines drawn at chapter 1, verse 18 to 25. It is important to note here that Joseph is the only real character in the story. Mary is kept consistently in the background and passive. She never speaks. She is barely mentioned. Joseph is the main character of this passage. He is the one who has his character described, who must deliberate internally when he faces the dilemma of his pregnant betrothed wife, and he's the one who receives the dream from the angel and is directly addressed. And he is the one who takes action after the dream. The audience of Matthew may not even know that Mary, if Mary knows the source of her pregnancy. The narrative structure of this pericope is fairly linear. Mary is found to be, in the passive, pregnant by the, or perhaps a, Holy Spirit. Raymond Brown asserts here that Matthew wants the reader to know more than do the characters in the story, so that the reader will not entertain for a moment the suspicion that grows in Joseph's mind. Leaving aside the question of a reader for an ancient text, Brown is correct in noting here that Matthew preempts the angel's dream announcement to Joseph. In a narrative sense, this may keep the reader from suspecting Mary of adultery, as Joseph evidently does, but it also highlights Mary's plight. How do you explain the pregnancy of a virgin? Matthew is uninterested in how Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant. It is enough for his story that Joseph knows that she is. Indeed, along with the agent of her pregnancy, Matthew makes it clear in this verse that Joseph has not consummated his marriage by inserting the phrase, before they had come together. Mary may be the mother of Jesus the Messiah, but she is here initially in danger of being a disgraced adulteress. This then sets up the halachic dilemma for Joseph. He is betrothed to a woman who is pregnant and not by him. Since Matthew keeps Mary an entirely passive character, without her own enunciation as in Luke, this serves to throw Joseph's decision and the subsequent change of his mind into sharper relief. The next thing that happens in the narrative is that Joseph makes his decision to, quote, put her away. Here we get some information about the person who Joseph is. He is righteous, dikaios. This is followed quickly with the information that he does not want to expose her, as most adulteresses were exposed, and he plans to put her away quietly. Whether Joseph's status of being dikaios is reflected in his decision to put Mary away, in accordance with the commandment about adulterous wives, or whether it is reflected in his decision to do it quietly and to spare her the spectacle of a convicted adulteress, is debated by scholars and depends often on where one falls on the Jewishness of Matthew and his respect for the Torah of Moses and its attendant halacha, its interpretation. Brown believes that dikaios here is used to mean respect for the Torah against what he sees as the normal connotations of it in Matthew. W.F. Albright and C.S. Mann cite Josephus' use of dikaios and interpret it as indicating Joseph's dedication to the law. Noland agrees with this, that it means Joseph's respect for the law, but he says there ought to be no, quote, tension between the righteousness and Joseph's decision to follow the uncharacteristic path of putting a wife away quietly. Ulrich Luz prefers to read Joseph's Gerechtigkeit as his compassion towards Mary, although he allows that Matthew does not here contrast observance of the law with a lenient or compassionate interpretation of it. Craig Keener identifies no less than 5 lessons that we may learn from Joseph's righteousness, blending Joseph's respect for the law with his compassion, but Keener leans away from the halachic aspect of dikaios. He says, Matthew does not state that Joseph was righteous because he was divorcing Mary, though he makes clear that Joseph was not unrighteous for doing so. Rather, he emphasizes that Joseph was righteous for divorcing Mary privately. Elian Cuvier prefers the reading that Matthew is leaving behind Jewish practice and asserts that Joseph's faithfulness to the God of Israel and his law is the premier complication or disturbing force in the Messianic narrative, and especially of the accomplishment of the birth of the Messiah according to God's will. Considering dikaios is a universally positive characteristic, Cuvier's interpretation does not seem to me to be justified and relies more heavily on his ideological commitment vis-a-vis Matthew and Jewish practice and belief than anything warranted in the text. Keener's reading also seems a bit suspect to me. Characterizing Joseph as dikaios does not, as Keener asserts, make clear that Joseph was unrighteous for divorcing Mary. No ancient audience would consider a man unrighteous for putting away a wife or a betrothed wife for being pregnant by another agent, especially in this case, as Joseph is yet unaware of the agent of Mary's pregnancy, and would therefore have to assume that another human was the father. There is, of course, no reason to read divorcing an apparently adulterous wife quietly, as in conflict with any commandment in the Torah. The Torah expects such a divorce to happen, and a public trial is only called for when the woman is suspected, not proven, of adultery, such as the case of the sotah in Numbers 5 or the surprise on the wedding night in Deuteronomy 22. I believe that Matthew uses dikaios as the entrance to Joseph's halachic dilemma, and therefore also to instruct his audience. As pointed out above, the pericope is really about Joseph. He is the main character. Confronted with a pregnant betrothed wife, the appropriate response, both legally and halachically, is to call off the wedding. Keener points out that by Jewish, Greek, and Roman law, men were required to divorce adulterous wives. Ben Witherington offers a romantic reading in which the dilemma is not halachic, but emotional. He says Joseph will be portrayed as a son of David caught between a rock and a hard place, more particularly between the law, as he is a righteous law-abiding Jew, and his love for Mary. Considering the fact that most marriages in the ancient world were arranged and women were never left alone with men, it seems unlikely that Joseph has any real personal emotional connection to Mary. Ross Kramer notes that in ancient writing about the family, emotional bonds are between father and son or mother and son. Spousal affection is hardly mentioned except to extol the obedience of a wife. Instead, Joseph's calculus has to be about the families they come from and who would represent in a public divorce. How Joseph knows Mary is pregnant is unimportant to Matthew. However, since in the next verse he decides to put her away quietly, the narrative implication is that the matter was probably private among the two families. If the pregnancy was public, a quiet divorce would be impossible. Joseph, therefore, is dikaios, both in his observance of Torah and in his treatment of Mary. Since the audience already knows that Mary is pregnant by the Holy Spirit, they are already feeling the halachic dilemma. The audience knows both that Mary is not adulterous, but also that Joseph should divorce her. The angel of the Lord then appears to Joseph in a dream, and addressing him as son of David, tells him not to fear to take Mary as his wife, because her pregnancy is by the Holy Spirit. It can be assumed that in this case, using the title Angel of the Lord, Matthew intends the audience to understand that the angel is delivering divine instruction. There are then a few narrative effects of this dream. The first is to inform Joseph of the source of Mary's pregnancy. This by itself does not necessarily change the halacha of the situation. Mary is still pregnant and she is not married. It is, however, the angel's command not to fear, but to take Mary as his wife anyway, which resolves the dilemma. The divine command changes the halacha for Joseph. He will not be sinning if he goes through with his planned marriage. It also establishes for Matthew's audience divine revelation as a new source for interpreting the commands of the Torah. It is not, as Cuvier says, something superior, about the righteousness of Joseph, which resolves the halachic and narrative dilemma, but instead a new source of halachic rulings directly from an angel of the Lord. Witherington points out that in depicting Joseph as, quote, open to spiritual direction, which comes in the form of the dream which an angel of the Lord appears to him, enhances rather than detracts from the characterization of Joseph as dikaios. Having resolved the dilemma, the angel continues with his birth announcement, including the gender of the child, his name, and his divinely given mission. Matthew then inserts a side note, telling the audience that this is to fulfill the text from Isaiah 7:14. After this, Joseph continues in his righteous characteristic. Having been informed by God that he should marry Mary, he does so upon waking. The narrative of Matthew 1:18-25 sets up a sympathetic Joseph, confronted with a violation of Torah and its interpretation, and provides a divine resolution. Joseph, on finding the unexpected and unexplained pregnancy of his betrothed wife, resolves to do the right thing and put her away quietly. This action is correct both according to Torah and secular Roman law. Both would demand that he divorce her. He is further regarded as praiseworthy for doing it quietly instead of with a public trial. It takes a divine message delivered by the angel of the Lord in a dream to change his mind and resolve this halachic dilemma. New information is delivered to him that Mary is not pregnant because of adultery, but by the Holy Spirit. God has divinely instructed Joseph to violate norma halacha and marry Mary anyway. This narrative and its position in the wider narrative of the whole gospel establishes at the beginning both the divine origin of Jesus, the Messiah for Matthew's audience, and also the fact that in Matthew's narrative world, God is taking a hand in Israel's history and delivering a new source of Torah interpretation with the one who will save his people from their sins. Thank you very much if you stuck your way through this whole presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Leah. Let me see if I can bring us all back in. And Tom, let me throw it over to you if you would like to ask a question. But first, Tom, unmute yourself so we can hear you asking your question.
Very sorry. I was thanking Leah for a very fine paper. I would start just an observation. How many men were quoted in the paper about this woman's pregnancy? Just an observation, not a question. I do have two sort of observational question kind of things. One is I'm curious, the dream is so important here, and clearly Joseph has no doubt that what the dream says and how it should be interpreted, and that's unusual in the ancient world. Usually there's complexity with these dreams, subject to interpretation. But the dreams fade out until the end of Matthew's gospel. But I'm curious if you've given any thought to sort of the source critical kinds of questions here. Do you see the birth narrative as coming from a different, because God doesn't speak to Jesus in dreams. Dreams don't play a big role outside of the beginning and the end of the gospel. I'm curious if you have any form critical suspicions about the birth narrative and how it comes to us.
Well, most scholars agree that it's a particularly Matthean element. Although there is an enunciation, and a genealogy in Luke, they're completely different. This is particular to Matthew's interpretation. And it seems to have come in fairly early in the Matthean kind of construction. And yeah, my interpretation, in my view, this reinforces the scholars who are arguing kind of for a Jewish Matthew and a Jewish Jesus following audience of Matthew. Because this is so caught up in Torah and Torah interpretation and how to, stay within the commandments. As far as source criticism, those are my
certainly
conclusions.
Dreams don't play a big role in in Mark or in Q or even in the uniquely Matthean things outside of here. You do have the dream at the end with Pilate. But the other question I had, I'm intrigued that the angel in the dream tells Joseph not to be afraid. And I'm curious how this language of not being afraid figures into your understanding of Joseph's motivations for putting Mary away and doing so quietly. I mean, what is he afraid of, and what fear does this alleviate, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I only very briefly kind of skipped over that in my paper. You're right. And in my case, I did interpret it as fear of violating Torah. That if he would continue on with his marriage, he would be marrying an adulterous woman. He doesn't see himself as, Hosea. And so when he doesn't have to fear anything spiritually, religiously, you might say. He's not violating Torah. He's not violating a mitzvah, a commandment of God. But he's also not violating, his family's honor or his own honor in that kind of thing, because this is an unusual occurrence. This is a divine supernatural occurrence.
If I can cheat and ask one more question, when you said that, it sparked a thought in my mind where you have the famous divorce sayings in 5 and 19 in Matthew. Right. And oddly, in the Sermon on the Mount, if a man divorces his wife, he makes her an adulteress. He doesn't become an adulterer, he makes her an adulteress. And I'm curious if you see that that curious, very patriarchal understanding in the Sermon on the Mount reflected in this passage too.
Well, the thing in the Sermon on the Mount is that he says if a man divorces his wife for anything other than unfaithfulness. So I do see that kind of in the narrative construction. I do see that as a narrative callback to this story of Joseph and Mary. And yes, as you say, it's entirely patriarchal. This is all about Joseph. Mary is completely passive. This is all about Joseph. It's all about Joseph's thoughts, Joseph's honor, Joseph's standing vis-a-vis Torah and the commandments in the Torah. So yeah, that's exactly what I say. It's a narrative callback.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very good paper. Dr. Kelly?
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Tom. And thanks everyone for tuning in to this installment. Take good care, everyone.